The desert night swallowed sound the way it always had, complete absolute. But not tonight. Tonight the silence shattered under the thunder of 298 Harley-Davidson engines, rolling down Route 66 like an iron river, their headlights cutting through the Arizona darkness, like searchlights hunting for something lost. At the head of this steel parade rode a man who had no business being there. Garrett Ironside Dalton, 67 years old, leather jacket hanging loose on shoulders that had once been broader, stronger. His hands gripped the handlebars with the kind of certainty that comes only from a lifetime of holding on when letting go would have been easier. The bike beneath him was a 1997 Heritage Softail. Not the newest, not the fastest, but it was his, had been his for 25 years. The same bike he'd ridden on the night everything changed. The same bike that had carried him away from death and towards something he'd almost forgotten how to recognize. Hope. Behind him, 297 other machines roared in formation. Men who had chosen to be here, men who had dropped everything, jobs, families, comfort, to ride through the night for a reason most of them didn't fully understand. They only knew that when Garrett Dalton called, you answered. And when Garrett Dalton didn't call, but the Brotherhood heard, he needed you anyway. You came twice as fast. The town of Redemption Creek appeared on the horizon like a postcard from America's forgotten places. Population 3,000, 2 stoplights, 1 main street. The kind of town where everyone knew your name and half your business, whether you wanted them to or not. A place where time moved slower, where handshakes still meant something, where the diner served coffee in mugs that had been chipped and repaired more times than anyone could count. But tonight, Redemption Creek would remember this moment for the rest of its existence. The convoy slowed as they entered town, engines dropping to a predatory idle. Windows lit up along Main Street, curtains pulled back. Faces appeared in doorways, some curious, some frightened, all transfixed by the sight of nearly 300 motorcycles rolling through their streets like a mechanized army on a mission. At the end of Hickory Lane stood a house that had seen better days. Wooden frame paint-peeling porch sagging under the weight of decades. The kind of house that held memories in its walls the way a grave holds bones. Sacred, permanent, unmovable. On that porch stood a woman who looked like she'd been carved from the same wood as the house itself. Margaret Callahan, 88 years old, white hair pulled back in a bun that had probably looked the same for 40 years. Hands that trembled not from fear, but from the simple reality of having lived long enough to see everything twice. She stood behind the screen door, one hand on the frame, watching the river of headlights approach. Her face showed no surprise, no relief, just a quiet kind of resignation that comes when you've been waiting for something so long you'd almost convinced yourself it would never arrive. In front of her house stood a man who didn't belong there. 40-ish, expensive suit that looked out of place in this neighborhood, hair slicked back with too much product, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. He held a clipboard like it was a weapon, pointing it at Maggie's front door with the casual authority of someone who'd never been told no and meant it. Mrs. Callahan, he was saying, his voice carrying that particular tone of false patience that barely concealed contempt. This is your final notice. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises, or we will proceed with, he never finished the sentence. The first motorcycle rolled to a stop 15 feet from Maggie's front gate, then another, then another, then 100 more filling the street, the yards, the empty lots, engines cutting off one by one until the night filled with a different kind of silence, the kind that comes right before lightning strikes. Garrett Dalton climbed off his bike with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to conserve energy, who'd learned that every movement cost something now, and the bill was coming due faster than he'd like. He walked forward. Not fast, not slow, just steady, the way a man walks when he's done running from anything. The man with the clipboard turned, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion to something that might have been fear. Behind Garrett, 297 bikers stood in silence, waiting, watching. I think Garrett said, his voice quiet but carrying across the sudden stillness like a stone dropped in still water. The lady said she needs more time. The clipboard man's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Who the hell are you? Garrett didn't answer immediately. He looked past the man, past the porch to where Maggie stood behind the screen door. Their eyes met. Recognition flared in her face like a match struck in darkness. Garrett, her voice cracked on his name. Garrett Dalton. He nodded once. Yes, ma'am, I came back, like I promised. The clipboard man looked between them, trying to understand what was happening, why the script had suddenly changed. Look, I don't know what this is, but this property is scheduled for Leave. The word came from behind Garrett, a massive man with arms like tree trunks and a beard that could hide small animals. Boone Mackenzie, who'd ridden 800 miles in 18 hours to be here. Now, the clipboard man looked at the sea of leather and chrome and weathered faces. Men who'd seen things he couldn't imagine. Men who'd survived things he'd never have to. Men who'd made a decision about which side of this line they stood on, and nothing would move them. He backed toward his car, hands up like Garrett, and his brothers were pointing guns instead of just standing there. This isn't over. Mr. Blackwood will... Tell Mr. Blackwood, Garrett interrupted, his voice still quiet, still calm, that Garrett Dalton would like to have a conversation with him at his earliest convenience. The man got in his car and left rubber on the asphalt in his hurry to leave. Garrett stood there for a moment watching the taillights disappear. Then he turned and walked up the 3 steps to Maggie's porch. Each step took effort. Each step cost something. But he made them anyway. Maggie pushed open the screen door. In the yellow porch light, Garrett could see how the years had changed her. Smaller now, frailer, the kind of fragile that comes not from weakness, but from having been strong for too long without rest. But her eyes were the same, sharp, clear, missing nothing. "You came back," she whispered. "I gave you my word, ma'am." He removed his helmet, held it against his chest like a soldier standing at attention. 25 years ago, I said if you ever needed anything, all you had to do was call. You didn't call, but I heard anyway. She reached out one trembling hand and touched his face, her palm cool against his cheek. "You're sick." It wasn't a question. Maggie had always been able to see through people down to the truth they tried to hide even from themselves. "Yes, ma'am," Garrett admitted. "I am." "Then why are you here? You should be right here." He covered her hand with his own, held it there for just a moment. "This is exactly where I should be." Behind them, the sound of 297 motorcycles being kicked to silence. 297 men beginning to make camp in a town that would never forget this night. 297 reasons why some debts could never be paid, only honored. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why nearly 300 men rode through the night for one elderly woman they'd never met, why Garrett Dalton would spend his last strength on a fight that wasn't his to win, you have to go back. Back to another night, another winter, another version of Garrett who didn't know yet that sometimes the people you save end up saving you right back. 48 hours earlier, Garrett's world had been much smaller and infinitely lonelier. 48 hours earlier, the garage smelled like motor oil and yesterday's coffee. Garrett sat on a rolling stool, an envelope in his hands, staring at words that refused to make sense no matter how many times he read them. Stage 4 adenocarcinoma, metastatic, limited treatment options available. Life expectancy without intervention 3 to 6 months. With aggressive treatment, possibly 12 to 18 months, though quality of life would be significantly impacted. The paper trembled slightly, not from fear. Garrett had stopped being afraid of death somewhere around his 3rd tour, his 2nd firefight, his first time holding a dying friend's hand and lying about how it was going to be okay. The trembling was from something else, relief maybe, or just the body's way of acknowledging what the mind had known for months. The pain in his chest, the cough that wouldn't quit, the way breathing had become something to think about instead of something that just happened. He set the letter down on his workbench next to a carburetor he'd been rebuilding for a kid who couldn't afford a real mechanic. The kid would have to find someone else now. There were things Garrett wouldn't finish, projects left undone, promises that would expire with him. The thought didn't bother him as much as it should have. Garrett had lived 67 years. 30 of them borrowed time he never should have had in the first place. When your entire platoon dies in the desert and you walk away without a scratch, you spend the rest of your life waiting for the universe to correct its accounting error, waiting for the bill to come due. Looked like it finally had. He stood, walked to the small office area he'd set up in the corner of the garage. On the wall hung a photograph faded, colors washed out by time and sunlight. 3 men standing in front of a wooden house in the snow, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling despite everything they'd seen, everything they'd lost. Garrett recognized himself in the middle. Younger, harder, hollower. A man who'd come back from war but left most of himself behind in the sand. To his left, Boone Mackenzie, built like a bear, grinning like he'd just heard the world's best joke. To his right, Colt Whitmore, lean and serious. The kind of man who spoke in Bible verses and lived like every day was a test he was determined to pass. Behind them, a house. And in the window of that house, just barely visible, the silhouette of a woman and 3 small figures. Garrett had kept this photograph for 25 years, carried it with him through 5 states and a dozen different apartments. It was the only picture he owned, the only proof that once, on the worst night of his life, something good had happened. His phone rang. The sound jarred him back to the present. He checked the caller ID. Boone Mackenzie. Speak of the devil, Boone. Garrett answered, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't talk to many people these days. Didn't see the point in small talk when every conversation felt like it might be practice for goodbye. Garrett. Boone's voice was gravel and whiskey aged by hard living and harder choices. You sitting down? I'm always sitting down these days. What's going on? A pause long enough to matter, long enough for Garrett to know this wasn't a social call. You remember Maggie Callahan? The name hit Garrett like a physical thing. He actually took a step back, one hand reaching for the workbench to steady himself. Of course I remember, he said quietly. Why? She's in trouble. Bad trouble. Some real estate developer named Sterling Blackwood is trying to force her out of her house. Legal pressure, financial pressure, every kind of pressure. She's got 48 hours before they evict her. Garrett closed his eyes, saw Maggie's face the way it had been 25 years ago. Older than him even then, but strong. Certain. The kind of woman who opened her door to 3 dangerous-looking strangers on the worst night of the year and didn't hesitate, didn't question, didn't judge. Is she? How is she? Another pause. This one heavier. Garrett, she's 88 years old, and from what I hear, she's not doing great. Financially, health-wise, none of it. She's alone in that house trying to hold on to the last thing she has left. Garrett opened his eyes, looked at the photograph on the wall, at the 3 men who'd been saved by a woman who had no reason to save them, except that it was the right thing to do, at the house that had been shelter and sanctuary when they'd needed it most. Where are you? He asked. Phoenix, but I can be on the road in 20 minutes. I figured you'd want to know. Don't just know. Garrett pulled his leather jacket off the hook by the door. I'm going. Question is whether you're coming with me. He could hear Boone's grin through the phone. Brother, I was packed before I called you. Just wanted to make sure you were still the man I thought you were. I'm a dead man walking, Boone. But I've got 3 to 6 months left, and I'll be damned if I waste them sitting in this garage waiting for the end. That's what I figured. Colt's already on his way from New Mexico. Called him right before I called you. We meet at the usual spot. Yeah, sunrise tomorrow. Garrett looked at the photograph one more time. And Boone, call anyone else you think might want to ride. This isn't just about Maggie. It's about paying debts that can't be paid any other way. Copy that. See you at sunrise, brother. The line went dead. Garrett stood there for a moment, phone in hand, feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Maybe years. Purpose. He walked through his garage, looking at all the things he'd accumulated. Tools. Parts. Projects half finished. A life measured in mechanical problems solved and engines brought back from the dead. None of it mattered. None of it would matter in 3 months when his lungs finally gave out and the borrowed time ran dry. But this mattered. He grabbed his go-bag from the closet. Always packed, always ready. Old habits from the service that never quite died. Extra clothes, basic supplies, and at the bottom, wrapped in an oilcloth, the Colt 1911 he'd carried since the Gulf. Never fired it outside of a range since he'd come home. Hoped he'd never have to, but hope had never been a strategy. Garrett locked up the garage, left a note for the kid about the carburetor, told him where to find someone who could finish the job, climbed onto his Harley and felt the familiar weight settle around him like an old coat that still fit despite everything. The engine turned over on the first try. Always did. He'd maintained this bike the way some men maintain their marriages, with patience, attention, and the understanding that neglect would cost you everything when you needed it most. As he rolled out of the garage and onto the empty street, Garrett thought about that night 25 years ago. The night he'd planned to die. The night Maggie Callahan had opened her door and, without knowing it, given him a reason to live. The desert stars were just starting to come out, same as they had been that Christmas Eve in 1997. Same sky, same stars. Different man looking up at them. Or maybe not so different. Maybe that version of Garrett, the one who'd survived when he shouldn't have, who'd been looking for a way out but found a way forward instead, maybe that version had been waiting all this time for the chance to pay back what could never be repaid. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark and full of promise. Behind him, his garage stood silent, his life's work, his solitary existence, everything he'd built in the years since the war. He didn't look back. Christmas Eve, 1997. The cold was the kind that killed, not quickly, not dramatically. Just slowly, steadily, the way hypothermia works when you're too tired to shiver anymore, and sleep starts to seem like a reasonable option. Garrett Dalton was 42 years old and he'd come to the desert to die. Not in the way people usually meant when they said someone came to die. Not seeking, not rushing, just allowing. His hands were numb on the handlebars of his Harley. His breath came in white clouds that disappeared into the darkness. The temperature had dropped to -15 and the wind cut through his leather like it wasn't even there. Perfect. He'd ridden out past the last gas station, past the last street light, past the last place anyone would think to look for him. The gun in his jacket pocket had started to feel heavy 3 hours ago. Now it felt inevitable. Garrett had tried. God knows he'd tried. 6 years since coming back from the Gulf. 6 years of therapy that didn't work. Medications that made him feel like someone else. Jobs that couldn't hold his attention because nothing civilian mattered the way things had mattered when life and death hung on every decision. 6 years of waking up wondering why he got to wake up when 37 better men hadn't. The faces came back at night, always at night. Jensen, who'd had a kid on the way. Martinez, who could make anyone laugh even when the situation was beyond hope. Corporal Williams, 19 years old, who'd asked Garrett 3 hours before the ambush if he thought they'd make it home for Christmas. Garrett had said yes. He'd lied. They'd all lied to each other right up until the moment the world exploded, and the only truth that mattered was that some people lived and some people didn't, and there was no reason, no logic, no justice in who ended up on which side of that line. He'd been the senior NCO. He'd made the call to take the faster route. He'd been the one who survived to write the letters to 37 families, explaining that their sons, brothers, fathers, husbands had died serving their country, and that it had meant something, and that they'd been heroes. More lies. They died because Garrett had made the wrong call. They died because he'd been impatient, because he'd wanted to get back to base before Christmas, because he'd thought he knew better than the intelligence reports about insurgent activity in that sector. And now, 6 years later, after trying every way he could think of to make the guilt stop, to make the faces go away, to find some reason to justify taking up space in a world that clearly had no use for him, Garrett had finally accepted the simple truth. He was done. The engine on his Harley chose that moment to cough, sputter, and die. Garrett coasted to a stop on the side of Route 66 miles from anywhere and almost laughed. Even his own bike was telling him it was time. He climbed off his legs, stiff from the cold, tried the ignition, nothing. Checked the fuel line, frozen. Of course it was frozen. He'd been riding in -15-degree weather for 3 hours. What did he expect? The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd come out here to end it on his own terms, and now he was going to freeze to death on the side of the road like some unlucky traveler in a cautionary tale. Maybe that was fitting. He sat down with his back against the bike, pulled his jacket tighter, even though it wouldn't help, and watched his breath form clouds in front of his face. Each exhale a little smaller than the last. Each inhale a little harder. This was it then, not the dramatic end he'd sometimes imagined. Just quiet, slow, the desert taking back what the war had failed to claim. He closed his eyes and then heard the sound of engines approaching. 2 motorcycles appeared out of the darkness like mechanical angels. They slowed when they saw Garrett pulled up alongside him. 2 men climbed off their faces, hidden by helmets and winter gear. "Jesus Christ," one of them said, pulling off his helmet. Boone McKenzie, though Garrett didn't know his name yet. Big man, good face, the kind of guy you'd want next to you in a fight. "Brother, what are you doing out here?" Garrett didn't answer immediately. What could he say? "I came here to die, but my bike broke down." The second man removed his helmet, thinner, harder, eyes that had seen things. Colt Whitmore. "We need to get him warm. Now, hypothermia is already setting in." "I'm fine," Garrett managed through numb lips. "The hell you are." Boone grabbed Garrett's arm, pulled him to his feet with a kind of strength that didn't ask permission. "There's a town about 10 miles back. We passed it. We're taking you there. Don't need help." Plus, Colt got in Garrett's face close enough that Garrett could see the scars on his cheek, the hardness in his expression. "Listen to me, brother. I don't know what you're doing out here. I don't know what you're running from. But you're not dying on this road tonight. Not on my watch. You understand?" Something in Colt's voice made it clear this wasn't a request. These 2 strangers had decided Garrett was worth saving, and they were going to save him whether he wanted it or not. They tied Garrett's bike to the back of Boone's and made Garrett ride behind Colt, holding on while they headed back towards civilization. Garrett didn't have the strength to argue. Didn't have the strength to do anything except hold on and feel his body slowly starting to register just how close he'd come to the edge. The town appeared like a mirage. Small, quiet. Christmas lights strung on houses that looked like they'd been standing since before the interstate was built. Everything closed for the holiday. Everything dark except for the occasional lit window showing families inside safe and warm and together. They knocked on 7 doors, 7 different houses, asked if there was somewhere 3 stranded bikers could wait out the night, get warm, maybe use a phone. 7 doors shut in their faces. Polite but firm. It's Christmas Eve. We don't know you. We can't help. Sorry. Garrett felt each rejection like a confirmation of what he'd already known. The world didn't have room for men like him, men who'd broken something inside themselves and couldn't figure out how to fix it. The 8th house was at the end of a street that dead-ended into desert. Small, wooden, paint peeling, porch sagging, the kind of house that had given up trying to impress anyone and just focused on staying standing one more day. Boone knocked, waited, knocked again. The door opened. An older woman stood there, backlit by the warm glow of a single lamp. Late 60s, maybe early 70s. White hair in a practical bun, worn dress, hands that showed a lifetime of work, but her eyes sharp, clear, missing nothing. She looked at the 3 men on her porch, took in their leather jackets, their long hair, their road-worn faces, the kind of men respectable people crossed the street to avoid. "Help you?" she asked, her voice carrying the accent of someone who'd lived in the Southwest their whole life. "Ma'am," Colt said, removing his helmet and holding it like he was in church. "We're sorry to bother you on Christmas Eve. Our friend's bike broke down about 10 miles out. We're just looking for somewhere warm to wait until morning. Maybe use a phone to call for a tow." The woman studied them. Garrett could see her making calculations, assessing risk. They were strangers. They were bikers. It was late. She was alone. Every rational reason to say no. She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said simply. "It's too cold to be outside." Just like that, no interrogation, no conditions, just an open door and an invitation to step out of the cold. The 3 men didn't move immediately, too surprised by the simple generosity. "Well," the woman smiled, a small quirk of her lips. "You coming in, or are you going to stand there catching your death?" They went in. The inside of the house was small but immaculate. Everything worn but cared for. Furniture that had been repaired instead of replaced. Rugs that had been mended. The kind of poverty that had dignity, that refused to apologize for not having more. And there in the living room, 3 children sat on a couch that was too small for them. 2 boys and a girl, between 7 and 11 years old, wearing pajamas that didn't quite fit, staring at the 3 strange men with wide eyes. "Don't mind them," the woman said, bustling toward the kitchen. "They're shy, lost their parents a few months back. House fire. I'm their neighbor and well, nobody else would take them, so I did. You boys hungry? I've got some soup I can heat up." Garrett stood frozen in the doorway, taking it all in. This woman, clearly not wealthy, clearly struggling, herself had taken in 3 orphan children. And now she was opening her door to 3 strange men who looked like they'd been spat out by the road. "Ma'am," Garrett found his voice rough and broken as it was, "we can't take your food. We'll just warm up and be on our way." She fixed him with a look that reminded him of every schoolteacher who'd ever told him to sit down and be quiet. "Young man, when someone offers you hospitality, you accept it graciously. Now sit down before you fall down. You look half frozen." Boone grinned. "Yes, ma'am." They sat. The woman brought soup. The children slowly relaxed, especially when Colt pulled a deck of cards from his jacket and started showing them simple magic tricks. "Name's Margaret Callahan," the woman said, settling into a chair that had probably been her husband's once. "Maggie to friends. That's Waylon, Emmett, and Clementine." The 3 children waved shyly. "I'm Boone. That's Colt. And the quiet one there is Garrett." Maggie looked at Garrett with those sharp eyes, seeing too much, always seeing too much. "You boys been on the road long." "Long enough," Boone said. "Where you headed?" Colt glanced at Garrett before answering. "Nowhere particular. Just riding." Maggie nodded like that made perfect sense. Like 3 bikers showing up on Christmas Eve with no destination was the most natural thing in the world. "Well," she said, standing, "I've only got 1 bedroom with a heater that works. You boys can have it. The kids and I will be fine out here." "Absolutely not," Garrett said, speaking for the first time since they'd entered. "We're not taking your warm room." "It's not a discussion, young man. I've got 3 growing children here. They can keep each other warm just fine on this couch. You 3 need the heat more than we do." And before you argue, she held up a hand. Remember what I said about accepting hospitality graciously. They tried to argue anyway. Failed. Maggie Callahan had clearly been winning arguments since before any of them were born. Garrett, Boone, and Colt ended up in the small bedroom. Single space heater glowing orange in the corner. They gave the lone bed to Garrett, who looked like he might collapse at any moment. Boone and Colt made do with sleeping bags on the floor. But Garrett couldn't sleep. Around midnight, he got up, moving quietly so as not to wake the others. Walked to the bedroom door, opened it just a crack. In the living room, Maggie sat in her chair, wrapped in a thin blanket. The three children were asleep on the couch, piled together for warmth under every blanket and coat Maggie owned. And Maggie was singing, softly, carefully. An old lullaby Garrett's mother used to sing to him, "You are my sunshine." Her voice was quiet-pitched, just loud enough for the children to hear in their sleep. A promise that they weren't alone, that someone was watching over them. That morning would come, and they would be okay. As Garrett watched, the oldest boy, Waylon, stirred, opened his eyes. "Grandma Maggie," his voice was small, scared. "Are you cold?" Maggie smiled, reached over to smooth his hair. "I'm just fine, sweetheart. You go back to sleep." "Why are you nice to us?" Waylon asked. "Nobody else wanted us. Why did you—" Maggie was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of truth that children could somehow always recognize. "Because I know what it's like to be alone, Waylon. I lost my husband last year. I know what it feels like when the world gets dark and quiet, and you're not sure if morning's ever going to come. And I decided that if I couldn't make my own world brighter, I could at least make sure you kids didn't have to feel that darkness. You're not alone, baby. Not as long as I'm breathing." Waylon closed his eyes. "Okay, Grandma Maggie, I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart." Garrett closed the door, walked back to the bed, sat down on the edge, and put his face in his hands. The gun in his jacket pocket suddenly felt obscene. Wrong. An insult to everything he'd just witnessed. This woman, struggling, grieving, barely making it herself, had opened her door to strangers. Had taken in children no one else wanted. Had given away her only warm room on the coldest night of the year, and sat in the freezing living room, singing lullabies to make sure three orphaned kids knew they were loved. And what had Garrett done? He'd come out to the desert to throw away the life she was fighting so hard to preserve in these children. He'd been ready to waste what she would give anything to give these kids time, presence, someone to count on. Shame hit him like a physical blow. He thought about the 37 men who died in the desert. Thought about how every one of them would have done anything for just one more day, one more hour, one more chance to hold their kids, or call their other parents, or just watch the sun come up. And here Garrett was healthy enough to ride a motorcycle hundreds of miles, strong enough to survive what had killed so many, alive enough to make a difference in the world if he'd just pull his head out of his ass and see that being alive wasn't about deserving it. It was about what you did with it. He pulled the gun from his jacket, held it in his hands, felt its weight. Then he wrapped it in a shirt and shoved it to the bottom of his pack, buried under everything else. When morning came, Garrett was the first one awake. He dug into his saddlebag and pulled out everything of value he owned. $5,000 in cash. His emergency fund. The money he'd been saving for a funeral he'd thought would be coming much sooner. He left it on the kitchen table, weighted down by the salt shaker, with a note written on the back of a receipt. "Mrs. Callahan, thank you for saving my life. This isn't payment. You can't pay for what you did. This is just me trying to make sure those kids have the Christmas they deserve. And maybe fixing that heater. You and those children are the best thing I've seen in 6 years. Don't ever think the world doesn't need you. Garrett Dalton, U.S. Army, retired. Hells Angels, MC." He left his phone number at the bottom. Thought about crossing it out. Left it anyway. The three bikers left at sunrise after Maggie made them breakfast she couldn't afford and insisted they take coffee for the road. She stood on her porch waving goodbye, three sleepy children peering around her legs, all of them bundled in blankets against the cold. Garrett looked back once, saw Maggie watching them go, saw her wave. He waved back, and then he rode away from that house with something he hadn't carried in 6 years. A reason to wake up tomorrow, a reason to keep trying, a reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, being the one who survived meant he had a responsibility to do something with all this borrowed time. 25 years later, riding through the Arizona night toward that same house, toward that same woman who'd saved his life without ever knowing it. Garrett thought about that morning, thought about how one act of kindness had changed everything. Thought about how now it was his turn to be the one who opened the door. His turn to say, "Come in," when the world was saying, "Stay out." His turn to prove that what Maggie had given him hadn't been wasted. Behind him, 297 engines roared. Ahead of him, a woman who'd saved his life stood on her porch watching the impossible sight of an army arriving to save hers. And Garrett Dalton, 67 years old, 3 months left to live, felt more alive than he had in decades. This was what he'd been saved for. This was why he'd walked away from that desert all those years ago. This was the debt that could never be repaid, only honored. And honor it he would, until his last breath. The road stretched ahead, and Garrett rode toward redemption, not his own, but the kind that comes when you realize saving someone else might be the only way to save yourself. The story was just beginning, and this time Garrett wasn't running toward death. He was riding toward purpose, toward family, toward home. The sun rose over Redemption Creek the way it had for 100 years, indifferent to the change that had arrived in the night. But the town woke to a sight it would talk about for generations. 298 motorcycles lined every street within 3 blocks of Maggie Callahan's house. Organized, orderly. A temporary city of chrome and leather that had appeared like an occupying army, except this army asked permission, paid for everything, and helped old ladies carry their groceries. Garrett stood on Maggie's porch in the early morning light, coffee cup in hand, watching his brothers set up camp with military precision. Tents in organized rows. Cooking stations. First aid area. Communications hub. These weren't just bikers. They were veterans. Men who'd learned organization under fire and never forgotten it. Boone approached 2 more cups of coffee in his massive hands. He handed one to Garrett, kept the other for himself. "Media's starting to show up," Boone said, nodding toward a news van parking at the end of the block. "Local station out of Phoenix. Probably won't be the last." Garrett sipped his coffee. Tasted like Maggie had made it, which meant it was strong enough to strip paint and sweet enough to qualify as dessert. "Let them come. We're not hiding." "Nope," Boone grinned to him. "We're giving them the best damn story they'll cover all year. 300 bikers show up to protect elderly widow from predatory developer. Hell, they'll probably give us our own Hallmark movie." Despite everything, Garrett smiled. "We're a little rough for Hallmark." "Speak for yourself. I'm delightful." The screen door opened behind them. Maggie emerged, moving with the careful steps of someone whose bones remembered every year they'd carried her. She'd changed into a fresh dress, hair pinned up the same way it probably had been for 50 years. "You boys planning to stand on my porch all day? Or are you going to come inside and have a proper breakfast?" "Ma'am, you don't need to cook for us," Garrett protested. "We've got supplies we can—" "Garrett Dalton, I've been cooking breakfast in this house since before you were born. I'm not about to stop now just because I've got an army in my front yard. Now get inside before the eggs get cold." Garrett and Boone exchanged looks. When Maggie Callahan gave an order, you followed it. Some things never changed. Inside the house smelled like bacon and fresh coffee, and something baking in the oven. The kitchen was small, barely room for 2 people, but Maggie moved through it with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to make do with less and still produce miracles. 3 place settings at the table. Garrett sat where Maggie pointed, noticed the chair was positioned, so he had a clear view of both the front and back doors. Old habits. She'd been married to a soldier once. She understood. "Where's Colt?" Maggie asked, setting down a plate of eggs and bacon that could feed a small battalion. "Organizing the perimeter," Boone said. "Man takes security seriously." "Always did." Maggie poured coffee, her hands steadier this morning than they'd been last night. "Having purpose did that to people. Gave them something to be strong for. I remember he used to check all the locks on my doors before you boys left. Made sure the windows were secure. Good man." "Yes, ma'am. They're all good men." Maggie sat down with her own modest plate, bowed her head briefly, lips moving in silent prayer. Garrett and Boone waited respectfully, neither man particularly religious, but both understanding that some rituals demanded reverence. "So," Maggie said, looking up at Garrett with those eyes that still saw too much, "you want to tell me what's really going on? Why you're here? And don't say it's just to help an old woman keep her house." Garrett set down his fork. Outside, he could hear the sound of his brothers moving around, setting up, preparing for whatever came next. 297 men who dropped everything to be here. "I'm dying," he said simply. "No point in dancing around it. Maggie deserved the truth. Lung cancer. 3 to 6 months, they tell me. Maybe less given how I'm feeling lately." Maggie's expression didn't change. She reached across the table, put her hand over his. Her skin was paper-thin, marked with age spots and the scars of a life spent working. But her grip was firm. "I'm sorry, son. Don't be. I've lived longer than I had any right to, longer than better men got to." He turned his hand over, held hers gently. But when Boone called and told me you were in trouble, it was the first time in months I felt like I had a reason to get up in the morning. So if anything, I should thank you again. What do you mean again? Ma'am, that night 25 years ago, I didn't come to your door looking for shelter from the cold. I came to this desert to die. I had a gun in my pocket and a plan to make sure I didn't see another sunrise. But then you opened that door. You let three dangerous-looking strangers into your home. You gave us your only warm room, and you sat in that freezing living room singing to three kids who'd lost everything, making sure they knew they weren't alone. Garrett's voice roughened. You saved my life that night, Mrs. Callahan. Not just from the cold, from myself, from giving up. You showed me what strength looks like, what grace looks like, what it means to keep going even when you've got every reason to quit. So no, I'm not here just to help you keep your house. I'm here because you gave me 25 years I wouldn't have had. And if I've only got a few months left, I'm damn well going to spend them making sure you get to stay in the home you fought so hard to keep. Maggie's eyes were wet. She squeezed his hand once hard, then let go and dabbed at her face with her napkin. You always were dramatic, she said, but her voice was gentle. Sitting out there on Christmas Eve like some tragic hero. I just did what any decent person would do. But most people didn't, Boone interjected quietly. We knocked on 7 doors before yours, ma'am. 7 people who had every reason to help and didn't. You were the 8th, the only one who said yes. Then they should be ashamed of themselves. Maggie started clearing plates even though no one was done eating. Movement for the sake of movement. You don't turn away people in need. I don't care what they look like or what you think they might be. You help. That's what being human means. The front door opened. Colt entered, removing his riding gloves with the methodical precision he brought to everything. He saw Maggie and his face softened in a way it rarely did for anyone else. Mrs. Callahan. He crossed to her, bent down, and kissed her cheek with a formality that belonged to another era. You're looking well? You're a terrible liar, Colt Whitmore, but I appreciate the effort. Sit down, I'll get you a plate. Already ate, ma'am, but thank you. Colt turned to Garrett. We need to talk, outside. Garrett stood, followed Colt onto the porch. Boone came too. The three of them stood in a line looking out at the organized chaos of their temporary encampment. Blackwood's people are watching, Colt said without preamble. 3 cars parked in strategic positions around the perimeter. They're taking photos documenting everything. My guess is they're looking for any excuse to call in law enforcement claim we're violating some ordinance. We're not, Boone said. I checked. We've got permits for the camping. We're on public land or property where we've secured permission. We're not blocking roads, not creating public hazards. Everything's by the book. Doesn't mean they won't try to twist it. Colt pulled out his phone, showed them a photo he'd taken. A man in an expensive suit standing beside a black Mercedes telephoto camera lens pointed at Maggie's house. That's not just surveillance, that's preparation for a legal battle. Garrett studied the photo. The man was probably mid-40s, too well-dressed for this neighborhood, too comfortable in his expensive car. The kind of man who'd never known what it meant to go without, to struggle to fight for every inch of ground. Sterling Blackwood himself, Garrett asked. No, just one of his people. But Blackwood knows we're here. Question is, what's he going to do about it? The answer came faster than expected. A convoy of police cars rolled down Main Street, lights flashing but no sirens. 6 vehicles, enough to make a statement without starting a panic. They stopped at the perimeter of the encampment, and officers emerged with the careful posture of men who weren't sure if this was a routine call or something that could go sideways fast. The lead officer was in his 50s, thick around the middle, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades mediating small-town disputes. His nameplate read, Sheriff Morrison. No relation to Garrett, just unfortunate coincidence. He approached the porch where Garrett, Boone, and Colt stood. His hand rested on his belt, close to his weapon, but not threatening. Professional. Wary. I'm Sheriff Earl Morrison, and he said, which one of you is in charge here? We don't really work that way, Sheriff, Garrett said, but I'm the one who called everyone here. Name's Garrett Dalton. Mr. Dalton. The sheriff's eyes flicked over the 3 men, taking in the leather, the tattoos, the bearing of men who'd seen combat. I'm going to need you to explain what's going on here. I got a call from Sterling Blackwood's attorney saying there's an armed militia occupying private property. We're not armed, Garrett said calmly. We're not on private property. And we're definitely not a militia. We're just citizens exercising our right to peaceful assembly. Is there a law we're breaking? Sheriff Morrison shifted his weight. I'm going to need to verify that you've got proper permits for this kind of gathering. Of course. Boone pulled a folder from inside his jacket, handed it over. Camping permits, assembly permits, property owner permissions from everyone who's letting us park on their land, fire safety compliance, health department notifications. We've dotted every I and crossed every T, Sheriff. We're not here to cause trouble. The sheriff flipped through the documents, his expression growing more puzzled with each page. This is thorough. We've done this before, Colt said. Most of us are veterans. We know how to follow regulations. Veterans? Morrison's demeanor shifted slightly, the wariness receding a fraction. What branch? Army mostly, Garrett said. Some Marines, few Navy. We're Hell's Angels, Sheriff, but we're also Americans who served our country. We're not here to intimidate anyone. We're here to support Mrs. Callahan. On cue, Maggie pushed through the screen door carrying a tray with coffee cups and what looked like fresh-baked muffins. She'd clearly been listening to the entire conversation. Earl Morrison, is that you harassing my guests? She set the tray down on the porch railing with more force than necessary. I've known you since you were in diapers. Your mother and I were in the same church group for 30 years. Now you're going to stand there and tell me who I can and can't have on my property. The sheriff actually blushed. Mrs. Callahan, I'm not harassing anyone. I'm just doing my job. We got a complaint about Sterling Blackwood being upset that someone's finally standing up to him. Maggie crossed her arms. That man has been terrorizing me for months, Earl. Threatening letters, middle-of-the-night phone calls, having his people bang on my door at all hours. Where were you when I needed the police? Morrison had the grace to look uncomfortable. Ma'am, those complaints were investigated. Investigated and dismissed, you mean, because Sterling Blackwood's family has money and connections, and I'm just an old woman nobody cares about. Maggie's voice hardened. These men showed up when nobody else would. They're not breaking any laws. They're just making sure I'm safe. If that's a crime, then maybe this town has bigger problems than I thought. A deputy approached from one of the other cars, younger, late 20s, the kind of earnest face that still believed in justice and fairness. His nameplate read Harding. Sheriff, Deputy Harding said quietly, I've walked the perimeter. Everything's in order. They're not blocking roads, not creating hazards. Honestly, sir, they're probably the most organized group I've ever seen. They've even got a designated firewatch rotation. Morrison looked between Maggie, the three bikers, his deputy, and the sea of leather-clad men watching this interaction with alert calm. No hostility, no aggression, just 297 men standing ready to defend an old woman's right to keep her home. The sheriff sighed, handed the folder back to Boone. Looks like everything's in order, but I'm going to be checking back regularly. Any violations, any problems, and you're all going to have to leave. Understood. Crystal clear, Sheriff, Garrett said. We're not here to cause problems, we're here to prevent them. Morrison nodded, started to turn away, then stopped. Mrs. Callahan, if you need anything, you call the station. Okay. I will, Earl, thank you. The police cars pulled away, and Garrett watched them go with a mix of relief and concern. They'd passed the first test. But Sterling Blackwood wouldn't stop just because the police hadn't found a reason to shut them down. This was just the beginning. As if summoned by the thought, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up across the street from Maggie's house. The door opened and a man stepped out who could only be Sterling Blackwood. Mid-40s, expensive suit that probably cost more than Maggie's monthly income. Hair perfect, smile practiced. The kind of man who'd learned early that money could solve any problem, and if it couldn't, you just hadn't spent enough yet. He stood beside his car, making no move to approach, just observing. Making his presence known. A psychological tactic, showing he wasn't intimidated, showing he could show up whenever he wanted. Garrett met his eyes across the distance. Neither man looked away. This was the enemy then, not some faceless corporation or distant developer. This man standing there in his $1,000 suit who'd decided Maggie Callahan's home was worth less than his profit margin. Sterling pulled out his phone, made a call while maintaining eye contact with Garrett. Deliberate, provocative. Then he got back in his car and drove away. That was a message, Colt said. Yeah, Garrett's hand unconsciously moved to his chest where the pain had been living for months. He's telling us he's not scared. He's got resources. He's got time. But he doesn't know what we've got, Boone said. What's that? Nothing left to lose. Inside the house through the window, Garrett could see Maggie washing dishes, her movements efficient and practiced. A woman who'd spent her whole life taking care of others, who'd opened her door to strangers, when no one else would, who deserved to spend her final years in peace in the home her husband had built. Garrett thought about the gun he'd carried to the desert 25 years ago. Thought about how close he'd come to pulling that trigger. Thought about all the years since then, not great years, not easy years, but years nonetheless. Years he wouldn't have had if Maggie hadn't opened that door. He'd told Boone they had nothing left to lose, but that wasn't quite true. They had everything left to prove. That afternoon, as the sun climbed toward its zenith and the temperature rose into the pleasant 70s that made Arizona winters bearable, Garrett got a visit he hadn't expected. A taxi pulled up. The back door opened. 3 people emerged. Garrett recognized them instantly, even though they had been children the last time he'd seen them. Waylon Emmett and Clementine Hartley. The 3 orphans Maggie had taken in all those years ago. They were adults now. Waylon had to be 36, maybe 37. Tall, solid build, the kind of presence that suggested authority earned through competence. He wore slacks and a button-down shirt, professional but casual. Emmett was a few years younger, leaner, with the slightly disheveled look of someone who spent more time in front of computers than in front of mirrors. Jeans and a hoodie despite the warm weather. Clementine was the youngest, early 30s, with sharp eyes and the kind of posture that suggested she spent a lot of time in courtrooms or boardrooms. Blazer and slacks, hair pulled back in a severe bun, all business. They stood at the edge of Maggie's property, taking in the sight of nearly 300 motorcycles and the men who rode them. Then Waylon's eyes found Garrett on the porch and recognition flared. Mr. Dalton, Waylon's voice was deeper than Garrett remembered, but it carried the same careful politeness he'd had as a child. Garrett stood, walked down the porch steps. It's just Garrett, and you're Waylon. I recognize you from the Christmas card photo Maggie sent me a few years back. They shook hands, firm grip, the handshake of a man who'd learned to project confidence even when he wasn't sure he felt it. This is my brother Emmett and my sister Clementine. We saw the news coverage, drove straight here from California. All 3 of you. We dropped everything, Clementine said. Her voice was crisp, professional, but underneath Garrett could hear the worry. Someone's trying to take Grandma Maggie's house. That's not happening. The screen door banged open. Maggie appeared, saw the 3 of them, and for a moment her face showed every one of her 88 years. The mask of strength dropping. What remained was just a woman who'd thought she was alone in this fight, discovering she wasn't. Babies, she whispered. They were up the porch steps in seconds, surrounding her in a group embrace that looked like it might crush her fragile frame. But Maggie was laughing, crying, holding on to all 3 of them like she could absorb them back into herself through sheer force of will. What are you doing here? Maggie managed between tears. You have jobs, lives. You can't just... We absolutely can, Waylon said firmly. You're our grandmother in every way that matters. You think we're going to let some developer push you around? We're not leaving until this is settled, Emmett added. And when we're done, Sterling Blackwood is going to wish he'd never heard the name Callahan, Clementine finished. Garrett stepped back, giving them space. Boone appeared at his elbow, watching the reunion with an expression that was trying very hard to be tough and failing. That's what we're fighting for, Boone said quietly. Right there, that's the whole damn reason. Garrett nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. An hour later, they all sat around Maggie's kitchen table, which had been built for 4 people and was now somehow accommodating 7. Garrett, Boone, Colt, Maggie, and the 3 Hartley siblings. Coffee and hastily assembled sandwiches covered every available surface. Waylon had taken charge of the conversation with the ease of someone used to running meetings. Okay, let's get clear on what we're dealing with. Emmett, you pulled the records. Emmett had his laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard. Yeah, Sterling Blackwood owns about 60% of the properties in Old Town Redemption Creek. He's been buying them up for the last 5 years. Grandma Maggie's house is the last holdout in a 3-block radius. What's his plan? Colt asked. Mixed-use development, high-end condos, boutique shopping, the whole gentrification playbook. He's already got investors lined up. The only thing standing between him and a $100 million payout is this house. So he's been pressuring Grandma Maggie to sell, Clementine said. What are the legal grounds for the eviction? Maggie spoke up, her voice small. He claims the house violates 15 different building codes. Says it's structurally unsound. Fire hazard. All kinds of things I don't understand. Clementine's jaw tightened. Let me see the paperwork. Maggie retrieved a folder from a drawer, handed it over. Clementine flipped through it with the speed of someone who read legal documents the way other people read novels. This is garbage, she said after a few minutes. Half of these codes don't even apply to residential properties. The other half are so vague they could mean anything. Any competent judge would throw this out. Except, Whalen said carefully, I'm guessing Blackwood has connections with the local court system. The judge who issued the eviction order plays golf with Blackwood's father every Thursday, Emmett said, still typing. I found photos on the country club's Facebook page. Garrett leaned forward. So we need either a different judge or evidence that this judge is compromised. Both would be ideal. Clementine tapped her pen against her notebook, thinking. Grandma Maggie has Blackwood, or anyone representing him, offered you money for the property. $50,000 for a house that my husband and I paid $30,000 for in 1972. My real estate agent friend says it's worth at least $300,000. Now maybe more given the location. That's lowball enough to be insulting, Clementine muttered. Classic strong-arm tactic. Offer you pennies, hope you're desperate enough to take it. I'm not selling, Maggie said firmly. This is my home. William built it with his own hands. I raised these 3 children here. I'm not leaving until they carry me out in a box. It won't come to that, Garrett said. We've got 48 hours until the eviction order takes effect. That's 48 hours to find something that stops this. I can dig into Blackwood's business dealings, Emmett offered. If he's dirty in this, he's probably dirty elsewhere. Financial records, email trails, anything that shows a pattern of corruption or illegal activity. I'll file an emergency injunction, Clementine said. Try to get a stay on the eviction while we challenge the building code violations. It's a long shot, but it might buy us more time. What can I do? Whalen asked. You're a surgeon, right? Garrett looked at him. Take care of Maggie. Make sure she eats and sleeps, doesn't stress herself into a heart attack. And keep an eye on me while you're at it. Whalen's eyes sharpened, the doctor and him taking over. What's wrong? Lung cancer, stage 4. I'm functional for now, but that could change fast. If I go down, Boone's in charge. Make sure he knows that. Garrett, Maggie started. No arguments, ma'am. I'm here. I'm useful, but I'm also realistic about my limitations. Whalen needs to know in case medical decisions need to be made. Whalen nodded slowly. Understood. But for the record, you look like hell. When's the last time you slept? Sleep's overrated. Sleep's necessary for continued consciousness, which you'll need if you want to be useful. I'm prescribing 8 hours tonight minimum. I'll sleep when I tell you to. Whalen interrupted with a firmness that suggested he'd learned from Maggie how to shut down arguments. Or I'll sedate you myself. Don't test me. Despite everything, Garrett smiled. The scared little boy who'd asked Maggie why she was nice to them had grown into a man who knew his own mind and wasn't afraid to use it. Deal, Garrett said. The planning continued into the evening. Emmett set up a workstation in Maggie's spare room surrounded by laptops and hard drives and equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. Clementine commandeered the kitchen table, spreading out legal documents and making calls to attorneys she knew in Phoenix. Whalen did indeed make Garrett lie down, performed a quick examination that was professional and thorough, then prescribed rest with the kind of authority that made arguing pointless. Garrett lay on Maggie's couch, the same couch where 3 children had slept 25 years ago, and listened to the sounds of organized chaos around him. Emmett's fingers on keyboards. Clementine's voice sharp and persuasive on the phone. Maggie in the kitchen cooking for an army because that's what she did when stressed. Outside through the window, he could see Boone and Colt organizing watch rotations. 297 men settling in for a siege that might last days or weeks. All of this for one old woman who'd opened her door to strangers. All of this because sometimes the debts that matter most can't be measured in money. Garrett closed his eyes just for a moment, just to rest them. When he opened them again, it was dark outside and someone had covered him with a blanket. The house was quiet except for the soft sound of typing from the spare room. He checked his watch. He'd been asleep for 6 hours. Garrett sat up slowly, his body protesting. The pain in his chest was worse, a constant pressure that made breathing feel like work. He'd been pushing too hard, he knew that. But what choice did he have? This was the last thing he'd ever do that mattered. He wasn't going to half-ass it just because his body was falling apart. He found Emmett still awake, eyes bloodshot, surrounded by energy drink cans and the glow of multiple monitors. Please tell me you found something, Garrett said. Emmett looked up, a smile spreading across his exhausted face. Oh, I found something. I found a whole lot of somethings. Question is, are you ready to hear just how deep this rabbit hole goes? Garrett pulled up a chair. Hit me. Sterling Blackwood isn't just a developer trying to make a profit. He's specifically targeting this neighborhood for a very particular reason. Emmett pulled up a document on one screen. His father was Duncan Blackwood, sheriff of this county from 1985 to 1998. The name hit Garrett like a punch. Duncan Blackwood. You know him? Yeah. Garrett's voice was flat. He tried to arrest me and my brothers on Christmas morning, 1997. Claimed we'd broken into Maggie's house. She told him we'd been invited, that we'd helped her. He tried to push it anyway, said we were clearly up to no good. Maggie threatened to call the state police and report him for harassment. He backed off, but you could tell he wasn't happy about it. Well, it gets better. Emmett clicked to another file. Duncan Blackwood was forced to resign in 1998. Corruption charges, bribery, witness tampering. The whole investigation started because someone filed a formal complaint with the state attorney general. Want to guess who filed it? Garrett already knew. Maggie. Bingo, she filed a complaint saying Sheriff Blackwood had harassed her and her guests and that she believed he was using his position to intimidate people who didn't fit his idea of acceptable citizens. The state investigated, found a whole lot more than just harassment. Duncan Blackwood spent 2 years in federal prison. The pieces were falling into place. So Sterling blames Maggie for his father's downfall. Not just blames, this is personal revenge dressed up as business development. He's not just trying to buy her house. He's trying to destroy everything she has as payback for what she did to his father. Can we prove that? Emmett's smile widened. That's where it gets interesting. I hacked into Sterling's email server. Before you ask, yes, it was technically illegal, so any evidence I found wouldn't be admissible in court. But it can point us toward what to look for through legal channels. And Sterling Blackwood has been obsessed with Maggie for years. Email after email about her. Plans to make her life difficult. Coordinating with the judge to ensure the eviction went through. But there's something else. Something bigger. Emmett pulled up another document. This one was older, dated December 1997. I found email archives from Duncan Blackwood's old accounts. They were never properly deleted, just sitting on a backup server. And in those archives, I found exchanges between Duncan and Sterling from back when Sterling was in college. Emmett opened an email, turned the screen so Garrett could read it. The email was from Duncan to Sterling, dated December 27, 1997. The problem with the Hartley house has been handled. The fire investigation will conclude it was an electrical fault. No one will look deeper. The evidence of what Hartley found dies with him. Clean slate. Garrett read it twice, his blood running cold. The Hartley house. That's Waylon Emmett and Clementine's parents. Daniel and Rebecca Hartley. They died in a house fire in September 1997, 3 months before we met Maggie. This email is saying the fire wasn't an accident. That's exactly what it's saying. Emmett's face was grim. Daniel Hartley worked as an engineer at Blackwood Construction, Duncan Blackwood's side business. I found employment records, and I found something else. He pulled up more documents, financial records, audit trails. Daniel Hartley found evidence that Duncan Blackwood was embezzling from the construction company, $2 million over 5 years. He reported it to the company board. A week later, his house burned down with him and his wife inside. The 3 kids only survived because they were sleeping over at their grandmother's house that night. Garrett felt sick. Sterling knew about this. Sterling helped cover it up. He was 21 years old, home from college for Christmas break. And according to these emails, he's the one who started the fire. The room spun. Garrett gripped the edge of the desk, fighting nausea. Waylon Emmett and Clementine's parents hadn't died in an accident. They'd been murdered by the same family that was now trying to destroy Maggie. Does Maggie know? Garrett asked. About the murder? No. The fire was ruled accidental. The embezzlement investigation died with Daniel Hartley. No one ever connected the dots. We need to tell Waylon and his siblings. That's not my call to make, Emmett said quietly. They deserve to know. But that kind of information, it changes everything. Their whole lives they've thought their parents died in an accident. Finding out it was murder, that the people responsible are walking free, that might be too much to handle right now. They're adults. They can handle it. Can they? Can they handle finding out the man trying to evict their grandmother is also the man who orphaned them 25 years ago? Emmett closed his laptop. That's a hell of a thing to process while trying to fight a legal battle. Garrett stood, paced the small room. His mind was racing, trying to fit all the pieces together. Sterling Blackwood wasn't just a greedy developer. He was a murderer, or at least an accomplice to murder. And he'd spent 25 years watching Maggie Callahan, the woman who'd taken in the children he'd orphaned, the woman who'd destroyed his father's career living peacefully in her little house. This wasn't about money. This was about revenge. And if Sterling was willing to murder two people to protect his father's secrets, what would he do to 300 bikers who stood between him and his vengeance? The answer was obvious. Anything. Everything, whatever it took. Garrett returned to the living room, looked out the window at the sea of motorcycles and leather-clad men. Warriors, every one of them. Men who'd faced down death and come out the other side. But warriors could die just as easily as anyone else. And Sterling Blackwood had already proven he was willing to kill to get what he wanted. This fight was about to get a whole lot more dangerous than Garrett had anticipated. But there was no backing down now. Not when the truth was finally coming to light. Not when justice was finally within reach. Not when 3 orphaned children might finally learn what really happened to their parents. Garrett pulled out his phone, dialed Boone. "We need to increase security," Garrett said when Boone answered. "Armed watch rotations. No one goes anywhere alone. And we need to assume Sterling Blackwood is capable of violence." "What did you find? The kind of truth that gets people killed." Garrett watched the sunrise beginning to paint the eastern sky. The kind that means we're not just fighting to save a house anymore. We're fighting to make sure a murderer doesn't get away with it twice. "Copy that. I'll spread the word." Garrett ended the call, stood on Maggie's porch as the sun rose over Redemption Creek. Day 2 of the siege. 48 hours until the eviction order took effect. And now they knew the real enemy wasn't just greed. It was guilt. And men driven by guilt were the most dangerous kind. The war had just begun. And Garrett Dalton, dying man, with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove, was ready for it. The decision of when to tell Waylon Beckett and Clementine about their parents weighed on Garrett like a stone in his chest. Heavier than the cancer. Heavier than the exhaustion that made every breath feel like lifting weights. He found them at sunrise, sitting on Maggie's back porch with coffee cups and the tired eyes of people who'd been up all night working. Clementine's legal papers were spread across a makeshift table. Beckett's laptop glowed in the early light. Waylon sat between them, the gravitational center holding his siblings together the way he probably had since they were children. "We need to talk," Garrett said. Something in his voice made all 3 of them look up. Waylon set down his coffee cup with the careful precision of a surgeon preparing for bad news. "What did you find?" Garrett pulled up a chair. Behind him through the window, he could see Maggie moving around in the kitchen, unaware of the bomb about to detonate in her backyard. "Your parents didn't die in an accident." The words hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. The world narrowed down to 5 words that changed everything. Clementine spoke first, her lawyer's mind automatically seeking clarification. "What do you mean?" "The fire that killed Daniel and Rebecca Hartley in September 1997 wasn't caused by faulty wiring. It was arson, murder, and the person who said it was Sterling Blackwood, acting on orders from his father, Sheriff Duncan Blackwood." Beckett's face had gone pale. "How do you know this?" "Because Duncan Blackwood was stupid enough to write it down. Because his son was arrogant enough to keep the evidence on an email server he thought was secure. Because 25 years ago, your father discovered that Duncan Blackwood was embezzling $2 million from Blackwood Construction, and a week after he reported it, your house burned down." Waylon stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden deck. He walked to the railing, gripped it hard enough that his knuckles went white. "You're telling me we've spent 25 years thinking our parents died in an accident, and the whole time it was murder?" "Yes. And the man who killed them is the same man trying to evict Grandma Maggie?" "Yes. The same man we've been fighting for the last 48 hours?" "Yes." Clementine had her hands pressed flat against the table, breathing carefully through her nose like she was trying very hard not to scream or cry or both. "Where's the evidence?" "On my laptop," Beckett said quietly, his voice hollow. "I found it. Email archives, financial records. The whole paper trail connecting Duncan Blackwood's embezzlement to Dad's discovery to the fire. It's all there." So the admission hung heavy in the air. Beckett had discovered that his own parents had been murdered while searching for dirt on the man trying to evict his grandmother. The weight of that knowledge showed in every line of his body. "Admissible in court?" Clementine asked, switching into professional mode because it was easier than processing the emotional devastation. "Some of it. The financial records are public domain if you know where to look. The emails are trickier since I obtained them through hacking, but they point to where we can find legitimate evidence. Enough to reopen the investigation at minimum." Waylon turned around and Garrett saw something he recognized. The same expression he'd seen in mirrors for 30 years. The face of a man who'd just learned that the story he'd been telling himself about his life was a lie and the real story was so much worse. "Does Grandma Maggie know?" Waylon asked. No, the fire was ruled accidental. She had no reason to question it. We have to tell her. Do we? Clementine's voice was sharp. She's 88 years old with early stage Alzheimer's. She's being evicted from her home. She's got 300 bikers camped in her front yard. How much more stress can we pile on before we break her? She deserves to know the truth, Waylon insisted. The truth can wait until we've secured her house and her safety. Clementine started pacing. The lawyer in her was already working through scenarios, building cases, planning strategy. Right now we have leverage. Sterling Blackwood doesn't know we've found this evidence. If we confront him with it before we're ready, before we've got law enforcement and media and every possible safety net in place, he could run. Destroy evidence. Or worse. Worse, Beckett looked at his sister. He's already killed 2 people to protect his father's reputation. What do you think he'll do if he knows we can prove it? If he knows his entire life, his business, his freedom is about to disappear? Clementine met each of their eyes in turn. Cornered animals are the most dangerous kind. Garrett had been quiet, letting them process, but now he spoke up. She's right. We move on this carefully or people die. Maybe us, maybe Maggie, maybe innocent people caught in the crossfire. So what do? Waylon asked. We build an airtight case. We get law enforcement involved at the state and federal level so local corruption can't bury it. We get media coverage so Blackwood can't make this disappear quietly. And we make damn sure that when we pull the trigger on this, it's overwhelming and undeniable and public enough that Sterling Blackwood can't hurt anyone else ever again. How long will that take? Garrett looked at Beckett. How long to compile everything into a format that law enforcement can use? 6 hours, maybe 8. I need to organize the data, create a timeline, make sure the chain of evidence is clear. Clementine, how long to get FBI involvement? I've got contacts in the Phoenix field office. If I can show them enough to justify opening an investigation, they could be here by tonight. Waylon, I need you to do the hardest job. Keep Grandma Maggie calm and safe. Don't tell her about your parents yet. Not until we know she's protected. Can you do that? Waylon looked like he wanted to argue. But he was a doctor. He understood triage. He understood that sometimes you had to stabilize the patient before you could treat the underlying disease. Yeah, I can do that. Good. Garrett stood, felt the room tilt slightly, steadied himself against the table. We've got until tomorrow morning before the eviction order takes effect. That's our deadline. Everything comes together before then, or Sterling Blackwood wins and we lose our chance to nail him. The next 8 hours were a masterclass in controlled chaos. Beckett worked with the focused intensity of someone who'd found his purpose, compiling evidence, and building a case that connected 25-year-old murder to present-day corruption. Every keystroke felt like justice delayed but not denied. Every file he organized was another nail in Sterling Blackwood's coffin. Clementine made calls, sent emails, leveraged every professional relationship she'd built as a lawyer to get the right people paying attention. Her voice was sharp, persuasive, relentless. She'd spent her career fighting for justice. Now she was fighting for family. Garrett coordinated with Boone and Colt, tightening security, preparing for the possibility that when Sterling learned what they knew, he might do something desperate. They established 3-man patrol rotations, designated safe zones, created evacuation protocols. These weren't just bikers playing soldier. They were soldiers who'd never stopped being soldiers. And Waylon stayed with Maggie, helping her cook for the army, in her front yard, keeping her spirits up, never once letting on that the foundation of their shared history had just cracked wide open. He watched her move through her kitchen with the efficiency of decades, and he wondered how many more times he'd get to see her like this before the Alzheimer's took her away completely. Every moment felt precious. Every moment felt stolen. By mid-afternoon, they had company. 2 black SUVs pulled up to the perimeter. Federal plates. 4 agents emerged, led by a woman in her 50s with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by anything. Special Agent Diana Mercer, FBI. Clementine met her at the edge of the property, Garrett and Boone flanking her like bodyguards. The rest of the bikers maintained their positions, watchful but not threatening. This was law enforcement. These were the good guys, probably. Ms. Hartley, Agent Mercer said, shaking Clementine's hand with a grip that suggested she'd spent time in the field before rising to administration. You said you had evidence of a 25-year-old murder connected to ongoing criminal activity. I'm listening. They convened in Maggie's living room. The space felt too small for what was about to happen. History being made in a room that still smelled like the bacon Maggie had cooked that morning. Beckett presented his findings with the clarity of someone who'd spent years explaining complex technical concepts to people who didn't understand computers. But this time there was emotion beneath the technical precision. This wasn't just data. This was his parents. The agents listened and asked questions, took notes. Agent Mercer's expression remained neutral professional, but Garrett saw the moment she realized this was real. Saw the moment she understood they had something solid. When Beckett finished, Agent Mercer sat back and looked at Clementine. This is solid preliminary work. If even half of this checks out, we're looking at multiple federal charges. Murder, conspiracy, corruption, wire fraud from the embezzlement, RICO violations if we can connect it to an ongoing criminal enterprise. Can you protect Mrs. Callahan? Garrett asked. We can put her in protective custody if necessary, but I'm more concerned about the 300 witnesses you've got camping outside. If Blackwood decides to cut his losses and burn this whole thing down literally or figuratively, you've given him a target-rich environment. My brothers can take care of themselves. I'm sure they can. But can they take care of themselves against hired professionals who know what they're doing? Because that's what Blackwood will bring if he's desperate enough. Mercer stood. Here's what's going to happen. My team is going to verify this evidence through proper legal channels. We're going to build a case that will hold up in court. And when we're ready, we're going to arrest Sterling Blackwood and anyone else involved. But that's going to take time. We don't have time, Clementine said. The eviction order goes into effect tomorrow morning. Then we get an emergency stay. I'll call the federal courthouse right now. This property is now part of an active federal investigation. Nobody's getting evicted until we sort this out. Relief washed over Garrett so intensely he had to sit down. They'd done it. They'd bought time. Maybe enough time to finish this properly. But Sterling Blackwood wasn't going to go quietly. 3 blocks away, in his executive office, overlooking what he considered his town, Sterling Blackwood received a phone call that changed everything. Mr. Blackwood, we have a problem. His attorney's voice carried the kind of careful neutrality that always preceded bad news. The FBI just filed for an emergency stay on the Callahan eviction. They're claiming the property is part of an active federal investigation. Sterling's hand tightened on his phone. What investigation? They didn't specify. But I'm hearing rumors about old cases being reopened, cases involving your father. The room went cold. Sterling stood, walked to his window, looked down at the town that should have been his kingdom, his legacy, his father's vindication. Get me everything you can on what they're investigating. I want to know who talked. I want to know what they know. And I want it in the next 2 hours. Mr. Blackwood, if the FBI is involved, then we need to consider the possibility that I don't pay you to consider possibilities. I pay you to fix problems. Fix this one. Sterling ended the call. His mind was already racing through scenarios, calculating odds, assessing threats. He'd spent 25 years building toward this moment. 25 years planning his revenge on the woman who'd destroyed his father. He wasn't going to let some dying biker and a bunch of orphans take that away from him. He made 3 more calls, the kind of calls that would have consequences, the kind of calls you couldn't take back. The first was to a private security firm that didn't ask questions as long as the check cleared. The second was to a man who specialized in making evidence disappear. The third was to his father's old contacts in law enforcement, the ones who still owed Duncan Blackwood favors, the ones who understood that loyalty outlasted legality. By the time Sterling hung up from the third call, he'd made his decision. If the FBI wanted a war, he'd give them a war. The confrontation came at sunset. Sterling's black Mercedes pulled up to the perimeter, but this time he didn't come alone. 4 SUVs followed, disgorging 8 men in tactical gear. Not security guards. Professionals. The kind of men who'd been to the same wars as Garrett and his brothers, just on a different payroll. Sterling emerged from his Mercedes wearing a suit that cost more than most of the motorcycles parked around Maggie's house. He walked right up to where Boone and 20 other bikers stood in formation, and for the first time since this started, there was no pretense of civility. I want to speak to Garrett Dalton. Sterling called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to giving orders and having them obeyed. Garrett emerged from Maggie's house. The pain in his chest was a living thing, now claws digging deeper with every breath, but he kept his movement steady, controlled. He descended the porch steps like a king, walking to meet an enemy general on neutral ground. Behind him, he heard Maggie's voice through the screen door. Garrett. It's okay, ma'am. Stay inside. He walked to meet Sterling. 20 feet separated them, an ocean of bad history and worse intentions. Mr. Blackwood, Garrett said, what can I do for you? You can get your little biker gang out of my town, you can stop interfering with illegal business transaction, and you can go back to whatever hole you crawled out of and die quietly like you're supposed to. Behind Sterling, his hired soldiers shifted slightly. Behind Garrett, 297 bikers went very still. The kind of stillness that comes right before violence erupts like a storm that's been building all day. That's not going to happen, Garrett said calmly. Do you know who I am? Sterling's voice rose at anger, cracking through the polished exterior like fault lines in expensive marble. Do you know what I can do? I own this town. I own the police. I own the judges. You're nothing but a dying old man playing hero for a woman who doesn't even matter. She matters to me. Why? The question came out like an accusation. Why do you care so much about some old woman? What is she to you? She's the person who saved my life when no one else would. She's the person who showed me what grace looks like, what strength looks like, what being human actually means. Garrett took a step forward. The hired soldiers tensed, but Garrett ignored them. And she's the grandmother of 3 children your father orphaned when you burned their house down. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Sterling's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, shock, fear, then something worse than fear. Calculation. The look of a man who just realized the walls were closing in and was already figuring out how to tear them down before they crushed him. I don't know what you're talking about, Sterling said, but his voice had changed. The bravado was gone. What remained was the voice of a man who'd just seen his entire life collapse into a single point of vulnerability. Yes, you do. Daniel and Rebecca Hartley. September 1997. You were home from college. Your father asked you to handle a problem, and you handled it by committing murder. Garrett kept his voice level conversational, like they were discussing the weather instead of 2 deaths and 25 years of lies. We have the emails, Sterling. We have the financial records. We have everything. Sterling's hired soldiers moved closer to him, protective instincts kicking in even though they probably didn't know what they were protecting him from. But they were 8 men against 300. The math was simple, and it didn't favor them. You can't prove anything, Sterling said. The FBI seems to think we can. Special Agent Diana Mercer and her team are going through the evidence right now. By my guess, you've got maybe 12 hours before they show up with arrest warrants. Sterling's face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan. You're bluffing. Am I? You want to bet your freedom on that? Your future, your father's legacy. Garrett smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a man who'd been to war and learned that sometimes the only way to win was to make the enemy understand they'd already lost. Here's what's going to happen, Sterling. You're going to go home. You're going to call your lawyer a good one, not the hack you've got on retainer. And you're going to prepare for the fact that your life, as you know it, is over. Because justice might be slow, but it's patient. And it's been waiting 25 years for you. Sterling stood there for a long moment, his mind visibly racing through options. Run, fight, destroy evidence, call in favors. Every option led to the same conclusion: he was out of moves. Then his expression hardened into something ugly, something that looked like his father must have looked when he realized Maggie Callahan had destroyed him. You've made a mistake, Sterling said quietly. You've made an enemy you can't afford to have. You think the FBI protects you. You think those badges mean anything. My family has been in this state for 3 generations. We have friends in places you can't imagine. And before this is over, you're going to wish you'd died in that garage 3 months ago instead of dragging yourself here to play hero. Garrett took another step forward, close enough now that Sterling's soldiers raised their weapons, slightly not pointing them, but making their presence known. I've made lots of enemies over the years, Sterling. Most of them are dead now. The rest wish they were. Garrett's voice dropped to something quieter, more dangerous. Here's the thing about dying men. We're not afraid anymore. We've got nothing to lose and nothing to prove except that we didn't waste the time we were given. And I'm going to spend my last days making sure that you pay for what you did. That those 3 kids get to know the truth about their parents. That Maggie gets to live in peace in the home she fought for. And if that means I die tomorrow instead of next month, so be it. Because at least I'll die knowing I did something that mattered. Sterling turned without another word, got into his Mercedes. His hired soldiers backed toward their SUVs, weapons still half raised, not taking their eyes off the sea of bikers until they were behind armor and glass. The convoy pulled away, leaving rubber on the asphalt. The sound of engines fading into the distance like a retreating army that would definitely be back. Boone appeared at Garrett's shoulder. That was either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. Garrett watched the taillights disappear. But he needed to know that we know, that there's no way out. Cornered animals are dangerous, but they're also predictable. They run or they fight. Which one do you think he'll choose? Fight. Men like Sterling Blackwood don't run. They've spent their whole lives believing they're untouchable. He'll try to destroy the evidence, try to destroy us, try to burn it all down before the FBI can close the net. So we prepare for war. We've been at war since we got here, brother. Now we're just fighting it on different ground. That night, Garrett couldn't sleep. The pain in his chest had evolved from constant pressure to sharp stabbing sensations that took his breath away and left him gasping in the darkness. Waylon had given him medication strong enough to drop an elephant, but Garrett had only taken half the prescribed dose. He needed to stay alert, needed to stay sharp. This was the endgame, and he couldn't afford to be fuzzy-headed when Sterling made his move. He sat on Maggie's porch in the darkness, watching his brothers maintain their vigil. Organized, disciplined, an army of aging warriors who'd come when called because that's what you did for family. The screen door opened behind him. Maggie emerged wrapped in a shawl despite the mild temperature, moving with the shuffling steps of someone whose body had long since betrayed them, but whose spirit refused to acknowledge it. "Can't sleep?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him with a small sigh of relief at taking weight off joints that had been carrying her for 88 years. "Sleep's overrated." She sat beside him, and for a while they just existed together in comfortable silence. The kind of silence that only comes when two people have been through enough that words become optional, a luxury rather than a necessity. "You're dying," Maggie said eventually. Not a question. A statement of observed fact delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone she'd used to comment on the weather. "Yes, ma'am." "How long? Oh, weeks maybe? Days if I'm unlucky, or lucky, depending on how you look at it." "And you came here anyway." "I came here because of it. Because if I'm going to die, I want it to mean something. I want to know that the years you gave me weren't wasted." Garrett turned to look at her, this woman who'd saved his life without even knowing it. "You saved my life, Mrs. Callahan. More than once. More than you know. This is me trying to save yours in return." Maggie reached over and took his hand. Her skin was paper-thin, marked with age spots, and the evidence of a hard life lived with dignity. But her grip was still strong, still certain. "You already saved me, son. You saved me the moment you showed up with all these good men. You showed me that the kindness I tried to put into the world came back. That the children I raised became the kind of people who call for help when someone needs it. That I'm not alone." She squeezed his hand. "That's not nothing, Garrett. That's everything." "There's something you need to know," Garrett said, "about Waylon and Beckett and Clementine's parents." And he told her. All of it. The embezzlement, the murder, Sterling Blackwood's role, the evidence they'd found, the FBI investigation. Everything. Every terrible detail that had been buried for 25 years. When he finished, Maggie sat very still. Tears ran down her weathered cheeks, cutting paths through skin that looked like aged parchment in the moonlight. But she didn't make a sound, just let them fall like rain. "Those poor babies," she whispered finally. "All these years thinking it was an accident, thinking they were just unlucky, and it was murder. It was calculated, deliberate murder by a man who's been walking around free all this time. They know now, we told them this morning. How are they handling it? The way you taught them to, with strength and grace and determination to see justice done." Maggie nodded slowly. "Good, that's good. Daniel and Rebecca deserve justice. Those children deserve to know the truth." She looked at Garrett, her eyes sharp despite the tears. "What happens now? Now we wait for the FBI to build their case. Now we make sure the Sterling Blackwood can't hurt anyone else. Now we finish this. And if he comes for us, then he finds out what happens when you threaten family in front of 300 men who've already made peace with dying." The attack came at 3 in the morning. No warning, no dramatic buildup, just the sudden eruption of violence that anyone who'd seen combat recognized instantly. The switch from peace to war in the space of a heartbeat. Molotov cocktails arced through the darkness, bottles filled with gasoline and malice trailing fire like comets falling from a vengeful sky. They crashed into the empty lot where some of the bikes were parked, exploded into pools of flame that licked up into the night sky and painted everything in shades of orange and red. Garrett was on his feet before conscious thought kicked in instincts, honed by decades of staying alive taking over. Around him, 297 other men were doing the same. No panic, no confusion, just immediate organized response. "Fire teams go!" Boone's voice boomed across the encampment. Men grabbed extinguishers, formed bucket brigades, attacked the flames with the efficiency of people who'd trained for exactly this scenario. This wasn't their first fire. Wouldn't be their last. Security perimeter. Then Colt was coordinating the other side, making sure this wasn't a diversion for something worse. Making sure Sterling wasn't using the fire as cover for something more deadly. Garrett ran for Maggie's house, his chest screaming in protest, but he ignored it. Found Waylon already there, getting Maggie and his siblings out through the back door, moving them to the predetermined, safe location they'd established the day before. "Is everyone out?" Garrett demanded, doing a quick head count. "Everyone's accounted for." Waylon confirmed, one hand steadying Maggie, the other checking his phone for any alerts from the perimeter teams. "What the hell is happening?" "Blackwood's opening move. He's trying to scatter us, make us choose between protecting the bikes and protecting Maggie. Classic military tactic. He doesn't know who he's dealing with." "No, he doesn't." The fires were under control within 10 minutes. Minimal damage, 3 motorcycles with scorched paint, some camping equipment singed, a tent that would need replacing. Nothing that couldn't be fixed or replaced. But the message was clear as the smoke rising into the night sky. Sterling Blackwood was willing to escalate to violence. The gloves were off. This was war now, not just a legal battle. Sheriff Morrison showed up 20 minutes later, lights flashing, looking exhausted and angry, and like a man who'd been woken from a deep sleep to deal with something he'd hoped would just go away on its own. "What the hell happened here?" he demanded, climbing out of his cruiser. "Firebombing," Garrett said. "Someone threw Molotov cocktails at our camp. Professional job. Knew exactly where to aim for maximum impact and minimum casualties." "Did anyone see who did it?" "No, sir, but I've got a pretty good idea who ordered it." Morrison sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "Mr. Dalton, I need you to understand something. I know Sterling Blackwood is not a good man. I know his father was worse. Hell, I helped investigate Duncan back in '98. But I need evidence. I need proof. I can't arrest someone on suspicion, even if that suspicion is probably right. What if I told you the FBI is investigating him for murder?" Morrison's expression sharpened, exhaustion falling away. "What?" "Special Agent Diana Mercer, Phoenix Seville office. She's building a case against Sterling Blackwood for the murder of Daniel and Rebecca Hartley in 1997, plus corruption, embezzlement, and a whole host of federal charges. Call her if you don't believe me." Morrison pulled out his phone, stepped away to make the call. Garrett watched him, saw the moment the confirmation came through. Saw Morrison's entire posture change from wary local sheriff to law enforcement officer who just realized he was dealing with something much bigger than a property dispute. When he came back, his entire demeanor had changed. "She confirmed it. Said she's getting arrest warrants drawn up right now. Should have them by morning." Morrison looked at Garrett with new respect, the kind of respect one professional gives another. "You people don't mess around, do you? Not when it comes to family. Well, I'm posting deputies around this property for the rest of the night. Anyone tries anything else, they're going to have to go through law enforcement first." Morrison started toward his car, then stopped and turned around. "Mr. Dalton, thank you for doing what the rest of us should have done years ago, for having the courage to stand up when it would have been easier to look away." As the sun rose on the final day before the eviction order was supposed to take effect, Garrett stood in the center of what had become a fortified compound. 300 motorcycles gleaming in the early light. 297 bikers, tired but unbroken. 4 FBI agents coordinating with 6 county deputies, all surrounding one small wooden house where an 88-year-old woman had once opened her door to strangers and changed the course of all their lives. Agent Mercer approached, phone in hand, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who'd just gotten very good news. "We've got the warrants," she announced. "We're moving on Sterling Blackwood's home and office in 1 hour. I need you and your people to stay here and stay safe. The last thing I need is vigilante justice complicating my case." "We're not vigilantes," Garrett said. "We're just witnesses making sure the truth gets told. See that it stays that way." Mercer started to leave, then paused, studying Garrett with the kind of assessment only another veteran could give. "For what it's worth, what you people did here, compiling that evidence, protecting Mrs. Callahan, standing up when no one else would, that's good police work. If you ever want a job with the Bureau, look me up." Garrett laughed, which turned into a coughing fit that brought up blood he tried to hide but couldn't quite manage. When he could breathe again, he said, "I appreciate the offer, Agent Mercer, but I think my law enforcement days are behind me, along with most of my other days. Fair enough. She looked at him with something that might have been sympathy but looked more like understanding. How much time do you have left? Enough. Then make it count. Planning on it. The FBI raid on Sterling Blackwood's properties was swift and professional. They found evidence that corroborated everything Beckett had uncovered. Email archives Sterling thought he'd deleted, but had only moved to a server he believed was secure. Financial records hidden in encrypted folders that weren't nearly as encrypted as he thought. A paper trail connecting him to his father's crimes and his own ongoing corruption, all laid out like breadcrumbs leading straight to a prison cell. Sterling Blackwood was arrested at 9:47 a.m., just hours before the eviction order would have taken effect. The timing felt poetic. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, corruption, embezzlement, wire fraud, and a dozen other federal charges that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. The eviction order was dismissed. The building code violations were thrown out with prejudice. Maggie's house was declared part of a federal crime scene, which meant it was protected until the investigation concluded, which would take months. By the time everything was resolved, Maggie would be long since safe. 3 days later, the 300 bikers prepared to leave. They'd done what they came to do. The fight was won. The enemy defeated. Justice served. Time to go home, whatever home meant for men who'd spent their lives on the road. Garrett stood on Maggie's porch watching them pack up with military precision, undoing in hours what they'd built over days, erasing the temporary city like it had never existed. Except it had existed, and Redemption Creek would remember, would tell the story for generations, would point to this moment and say, this is what brotherhood looks like. This is what family means. Waylon Beckett and Clementine stood with him, watching their strange army of saviors who prepared to disappear back into their regular lives. How do we thank them? Waylon asked, his voice thick with emotion. You already did, Garrett said. You gave them a reason to remember why they served, why they sacrificed, why brotherhood matters. That's worth more than money. That's worth more than anything. One by one, the bikers came to say goodbye to Maggie. Each one shook her hand or hugged her gently or just nodded with the kind of respect usually reserved for generals and presidents. She stood there taking it all in this tiny woman who'd become the center of something larger than any of them had anticipated. When Boone's turn came, he knelt down so he was eye level with Maggie, this massive man making himself small in the presence of true greatness. Ma'am, it's been an honor protecting you. The honor was mine, Boone. You and all these men, you reminded an old woman that the world still has heroes in it. Not heroes, just men trying to pay back a debt. Then I'd say the debt is settled, paid in full, with interest. Boone smiled, kissed her hand like a knight from an old story and stood. He caught Garrett's eye and something passed between them. Understanding, acceptance. Goodbye. The knowledge that they probably wouldn't see each other again, and that was okay because some friendships are complete in a moment and don't need a lifetime to be whole. Colt was next. He pulled Maggie into a hug that looked like it might break her fragile frame, but was gentle as a whisper, as a prayer. You keep being the light, Mrs. Callahan. World needs it. You too, Colt. Don't forget that. Don't let the darkness win. And then it was just Garrett and Maggie on the porch watching the last of the bikes roll away, their thunder fading into the Arizona distance until all that remained was silence and memory and the knowledge that something important had happened here. You're not going with them, Maggie observed. No, ma'am. Why not? Garrett looked at her, this woman who had saved his life twice now, without ever asking for anything in return. Because I'm tired, Mrs. Callahan. Because the road doesn't call to me anymore. Because I'd like to spend whatever time I have left somewhere that feels like home. And this feels like home. It's the closest I've ever gotten. Maggie nodded slowly, then took his hand and led him inside. Then you'll stay in the spare room, the one with the heater. You'll let Waylon take care of you, and you'll let me cook for you until you're sick of my cooking. I could never get sick of your cooking, ma'am. We'll see about that. The next 3 weeks were the quietest Garrett had known in decades. Time stretched and contracted in strange ways the way it does when you're dying. Hours felt like minutes. Minutes felt like hours. Everything was precious and fleeting and eternal all at once. Waylon had taken a leave of absence from the hospital, moved into Maggie's house to provide medical care, and Garrett's condition deteriorated. He was a good doctor, a better man, the kind of person who made you believe the world might turn out okay after all. Beckett and Clementine visited every few days, bringing news of the case against Sterling Blackwood, watching it build into something overwhelming and undeniable. A case so airtight that even Sterling's expensive lawyers couldn't find a crack to exploit. Garrett spent his days on Maggie's porch watching the town go about its business. Neighbors who'd been too scared to help before now stopped by with food and conversation. The local paper ran a story about the widow and the bikers that got picked up nationally. CNN came calling, so did the Today Show. Maggie politely declined them all. "I didn't do this for attention," she said. "I did it because it was right." Donations poured in anyway, more than enough to repair the house and ensure Maggie would be comfortable for whatever time she had left. Enough to set up a scholarship fund in Daniel and Rebecca Hartley's names. Enough to do some good in the world. And every evening, Maggie would sit beside Garrett, and they'd watch the sunset paint the desert sky in colors that reminded him why living was worth the effort, why every breath mattered, why he'd been right to keep going all those years ago when everything in him had wanted to stop. "Do you have regrets?" Maggie asked one evening as the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue. Garrett considered the question. "A few. I wish I'd come back sooner. I wish I'd told the people I cared about that I cared about them. I wish I'd spent less time running from my past and more time building a future. But, but I'm here now, and that counts for something. It counts for everything." On the morning of the fourth week, Garrett woke up and knew. The way you know things at the end. The way the body communicates when it's done fighting, when it's ready to lay down arms and accept what comes next. Waylon was there immediately checking vitals, administering medication, doing everything a doctor could do to ease the transition from this world to whatever comes after. "How long?" Garrett asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Hours, maybe a day." Waylon's voice was steady, but his eyes were wet. "I'm sorry, Garrett. I'm so sorry." "Don't be. This is how it's supposed to end, surrounded by family. That's more than I ever thought I'd get, more than I deserve." Maggie appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on her cane. She moved to the bedside, sat down in the chair Waylon pulled up for her, and took Garrett's hand. "I'm here, son." "I know. Thank you." "For what?" "For opening that door, for showing me what grace looks like, for giving me a reason to live long enough to make it count." "You made it count, Garrett. You saved me. You brought justice for Waylon's parents. You showed 300 men what brotherhood really means. You didn't waste a single day of the time you were given." Garrett smiled, felt the pain receding, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. "Tell Boone and Colt I said goodbye. Tell them the debt is paid. Tell them to keep riding." "I will. And tell those 3 kids you raised that their parents would be proud. Tell them that good things came from tragedy. Tell them that love wins, always. In the end, love always wins." "I will, sweetheart. I will." The room began to blur at the edges. Garrett could hear voices, familiar ones, calling from somewhere he couldn't quite see. Jensen, Martinez, Williams. Corporal Williams, who'd been 19 years old and asked if they'd make it home for Christmas. All the men he'd lost in the desert waiting for him on the other side. "Am I going to see my mom?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Maggie squeezed his hand. "Yes, baby. She's waiting for you. And she's so proud of the man you became. Tell her I'm sorry I took so long to get here. She knows, Garrett. She knows. And she's been watching you every step of the way." And then with Maggie's hand in his and the sound of family all around him, Garrett Dalton took his last breath and let it out like a prayer of gratitude. He didn't die alone. He didn't die afraid. He died surrounded by love, having spent his final days doing something that mattered. And in the end, that was everything. 1 year later, December 2023, on a crisp morning that felt like a memory of that Christmas so long ago, Maggie Callahan stood in her front yard surrounded by Waylon Beckett, Clementine, and 8 grandchildren who called her Grandma Maggie, even though only 3 of them were blood-related. In the yard where 300 motorcycles had once stood vigil, there was now a memorial. Simple, elegant, a stone marker with words carved deep enough to last for generations. Garrett Ironside Dalton, 1955 to 2022. U.S. Army, veteran Hells Angels, MC. He opened no doors, but he answered every call. Every Christmas without fail, 297 motorcycles would make the pilgrimage to Redemption Creek. They'd park in organized rows, these aging warriors who refused to forget. They'd share a meal with Maggie and her growing family. They'd tell stories about the man who'd brought them together for one last fight, one last stand, one last reminder of what they'd all fought for in the first place. And every year as they prepared to leave, Maggie would stand on her porch and wave goodbye, her memory fading a little more each year, but her smile as bright as ever. Some years she remembered their names, some years she didn't. But she always remembered the feeling, always remembered that she was loved, because she'd learned what Garrett had known all along. That family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when you need them. It's about who stands beside you when the world says stand down. It's about the debts that can never be repaid, only honored. And it's about knowing that when you open your door to strangers in the cold, sometimes you're not just saving them. Sometimes they're saving you right back. The sun set over Redemption Creek, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. And in the fading light, you could almost hear the distant rumble of motorcycles and the sound of a man who'd finally found his way home.